Have you ever had the strange feeling that what you're experiencing now has happened before? Not as a clear memory, but as a silent echo within your mind, almost impossible to explain. A place that seems too familiar, a conversation that sounds repetitive, a moment that feels like it's being relived, even knowing rationally that it's impossible. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. This feeling is more common than it seems. And no, it's not your imagination, it's not distraction, much less something in your head, in a pejorative sense. In fact, it is exactly what's in your head, in the most fascinating way possible. The human brain is an extraordinary machine, but it wasn't designed to show reality as it is. It was designed to interpret, predict, and react. And in this process, it creates mental shortcuts that help you survive, but that sometimes completely distort how you perceive the world. Think for a moment, how many times have you felt like you knew someone right away? Or had the impression that you'd been to a place you know you've never been? This feeling of familiarity arises quickly, even before you can think about it. It's as if the brain says, "This is known, so it's safe." Only then does the rational part try to understand what's happening. Have you ever experienced this? What's most intriguing is that this experience feels real. Very real. The body reacts, emotions arise, the mind tries to find explanations. And the more you try to understand, the stranger the sensation becomes. This happens because the brain doesn't wait to have all the information before acting. It anticipates, fills in gaps, connects patterns, and creates a coherent narrative, even when that narrative doesn't exactly correspond to reality. Here's a crucial point. The brain confuses familiarity with reality much more often than we imagine. When something seems familiar, the brain interprets it as true, reliable, real. This mechanism works well most of the time. It saves energy, speeds up decisions, and avoids dangers. But in certain situations it fails. And when it fails, it creates these mysterious experiences that leave us wondering, what just happened? Perhaps you're thinking right now about a specific episode in your life. A quick, almost imperceptible moment that you never talked about with anyone, but that has stayed with you. If this is coming to mind now, pay attention. Because it's not a coincidence. The brain loves to recognize patterns even when they don't really exist. And the more stimuli, memories, and emotions are involved, the greater the chance of this kind of confusion happening. The most curious thing is that these sensations usually arise when we're on autopilot, on ordinary days, in routine conversations, in seemingly mundane places. Precisely when we think we're in control. That's when the brain acts behind the scenes, making decisions before consciousness, mixing memories, expectations, and perceptions into something that seems real, but perhaps isn't. What if I told you that this strange feeling reveals something profound about who really controls how you experience reality? That there's a silent mechanism operating even before conscious thought? Stay with me until the end of this video, because from now on we're going to delve deeper into this territory where the brain, memory, and perception become intertwined. And what comes next may change how you understand your own experiences. And if, while you're listening to all this, a specific memory starts to surface in your mind, perhaps a moment when you paused for a few seconds trying to understand if it was real or just a strange feeling, know that this reaction is part of the process. Each person experiences this differently, and that's exactly what makes this phenomenon so fascinating. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, or even share a situation where you felt this inexplicable familiarity. Reading about these experiences creates a powerful connection between the listener and shows that no one is alone in these strange perceptions of the mind. When you comment, like, or share your perspective, you're not just interacting with a video, you're helping this type of content continue to exist. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who also wonder how the brain works behind what we call reality. A simple like signals that this topic matters, that these questions deserve attention, and that it's worthwhile to delve even deeper into these mysteries of the human brain. If you're curious about these strange phenomena of the brain and body, subscribing to the channel is a way of saying you want to continue exploring this with me. Here, each video is an invitation to look beyond the obvious, question what seems real, and better understand how the mind constructs our experience of the world. All of this happens because there is an interested, curious, and open-minded community ready to reflect. Now, as you reflect on all of this, hold on to that feeling. Because from here, we're going to start unraveling what happens inside the brain when it decides that something is familiar, even before confirming whether it is, in fact, real. When we talk about reality, there's a silent assumption that it's simply out there, ready, objective, waiting to be captured by our senses. But the truth, and here begins the shattering of expectations, is that the brain doesn't function like a camera recording the world in real time. It functions much more like an editor. A fast, economical, and extremely creative editor. Everything you see, hear, feel, and believe to be real first passes through a series of internal filters, automatic adjustments, and invisible decisions. What reaches your consciousness is already an interpreted version, not the raw fact. This happens because the brain receives fragmented signals. Light, sounds, smells, physical sensations. Everything arrives in pieces. And, to transform this chaos into something comprehensible, it needs to fill in the gaps all the time. It compares what is happening now with past experiences, stored memories, and already known patterns. It is at this point that familiarity comes into play as a kind of mental shortcut. If something resembles what has already been experienced, the brain assumes it understands it. And when it assumes this, it rarely questions it. The most curious thing is that this process happens outside the realm of consciousness. You don't decide to interpret the world this way. It simply happens behind the scenes of the mind. The brain is always trying to predict the next second, because predicting is more efficient than reacting from scratch. And to predict, it uses the past as a basis. This mechanism is fundamental for survival, for quick decisions, for adaptation. But it has a little discussed side effect. It can create an internal truth that doesn't exactly correspond to what is happening now. That's why what you feel as real often comes with a strange certainty, even without clear evidence. The feeling of familiarity gives the brain a false sense of security. It creates an immediate emotional impact as if saying, "Relax, I already know this." But knowing something doesn't mean it's actually happening the way you perceive it. Familiarity is not synonymous with truth. It's just a sign of recognition, and recognition can be misleading. This is a delicate point because it directly affects how we make decisions. If the brain interprets reality based on what seems familiar, it influences choices, judgments, and reactions without you realizing it. A conversation may seem repetitive because it activates old emotional patterns. A place may seem familiar because it shares similar stimuli with another experienced in the past. A situation may seem predictable because it fits into an already constructed narrative. None of this means that reality is the same. It only means that the brain found enough similarities to assemble a coherent story. There's a hidden truth in this process. The brain prefers coherence to precision. It wants everything to make sense quickly, even if it means adjusting the facts. This internal logic shapes our mindset, influences our personal journey, and creates a continuous sense of control. But, in practice, much of what we call reality is a dynamic construct, adjusted every second, based on what has already been experienced and what the brain expects to happen. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this mechanism completely changes how you perceive seemingly simple everyday experiences. That strange feeling of repetition, of immediate recognition, of "this has already happened," doesn't arise from nowhere. It's the result of a system that works tirelessly to make sense of the world, even when the world doesn't offer all the answers. It's a silent transformation of information into meaning. And the more you observe this, the more you realize that reality is not something fixed, but a constantly adjusting process. Each person experiences a slightly different version of the same moment because each brain interprets the signals based on distinct histories. The impact of this is profound. It affects relationships, choices, fears, expectations, and even how you trust your own perceptions. It's no exaggeration to say that there's a game happening behind the scenes of the mind, where past and present blend to create a sense of now. Perhaps the most uncomfortable thing is accepting that not everything that seems real is, in fact, reliable. But at the same time, this realization opens up space for important revelations. It invites us to question, to observe more attentively, and to understand that the human experience is less about capturing the world as it is and more about interpreting it in the best way possible. This is a key point in this journey, realizing that reality is not only lived, it is constructed. And it is precisely here that the feeling of familiarity takes on a new meaning. It ceases to be merely something curious and becomes a sign of how the brain operates, how it makes quick decisions, and how it shapes conscious experience. There is much more happening behind this simple sensation than most people imagine, and understanding this is the first step to seeing more clearly the limits of one's own perception. Before moving on, let us know how this is resonating with you. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the mental shortcut of familiarity reveals something essential about how the brain actually operates behind the scenes. The human brain is, above all, an energy-saving machine. It wasn't designed to analyze everything calmly, precisely, and with perfect logic. It was designed to decide quickly, to survive, to react before it's too late. And, within this evolutionary logic, familiarity functions as a true safety seal. When something seems familiar, the brain relaxes. It reduces the level of alertness, decreases cognitive effort, and assumes that the situation has already been understood. It's as if a silent part of the mind says, "I've seen this before, this poses no risk." This mechanism has been fundamental throughout human history. Recognizing a path, a friendly face, a safe pattern could mean the difference between life and death. Speed has always been more important than absolute precision. The problem is that this same system remains active today, in a world far more complex than the one for which it was originally designed. The brain continues to use familiarity as a basis for decisions, interpretations, and judgments, even when the context demands more attention. It prefers to trust what seems known rather than stop to verify if it is actually true. And this preference silently shapes our perception of reality. This mental shortcut influences simple choices and profound decisions. It affects how we trust people, how we interpret situations, and how we react emotionally. Something may seem right simply because it fits past experiences, not because it truly is. It's a subtle transformation of perception, almost imperceptible, but with a real impact on how we live. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort creates the illusion of control. There's a hidden truth in this process. The brain doesn't ask if something is true before reacting. It asks if it seems familiar. If the answer is yes, it moves forward. This logic helps explain why certain ideas seem right without us being able to explain exactly why. Or why some situations inspire immediate confidence, while others generate strangeness, even without a clear reason. The brain is constantly comparing the present with past experiences, looking for shortcuts to make quick decisions. And the more tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally involved we are, the more this shortcut is used. In moments of pressure, the brain further reduces the checking of details. It relies on patterns. It relies on memory. It relies on feeling. That's when familiarity ceases to be just a useful tool and becomes a trap. Because not everything that seems known is reliable. Not everything that sounds familiar corresponds to current reality. This dynamic happens so naturally that it is rarely noticed. It influences the mindset with which we view the world. It creates internal narratives that seem solid, but which are often built on incomplete associations. The brain doesn't lie out of malice. It simply does the best it can with the information available, prioritizing speed. The brain prefers speed to accuracy. This phrase summarizes much of human mental functioning. The impact of this on our personal journey is profound. Important decisions may be made based on familiar feelings, not on conscious analysis. Relationships may be maintained or avoided because of old patterns. New situations may be interpreted as repetitions of past experiences, even when they are not. All of this happens behind the scenes, while we believe we are reacting rationally and objectively. The most interesting thing is to realize that this constant search for familiarity creates a continuous feeling of stable reality. The brain needs the world to seem predictable. It needs to believe that it understands what is happening. And to achieve this, it accepts shortcuts. It accepts simplifications. It accepts adjusted versions of the truth. This doesn't mean we're always wrong, but it does mean that our perception is often an internal agreement between what is happening and what has already been experienced. When you begin to observe this mechanism, something changes. A kind of conscious detachment emerges. You realize that not all certainty comes from reality itself, but from the way the brain interprets known signals. This perception doesn't weaken the human experience, it deepens it. It opens space for more conscious choices, for less automatic decisions, and for a more honest relationship with one's own perceptions. And it is precisely at this point that the topic becomes even more intriguing. Because if familiarity functions as a security seal, what happens when this seal is activated at the wrong time? What happens when the brain recognizes something it shouldn't recognize? When it validates a feeling that doesn't correspond to the present? These questions begin to reveal even deeper layers of this phenomenon, layers that involve memory, emotion, and psychological time. Before we move on to this journey of revelations about how the brain constructs reality, write a simple sentence for me here. Comment below, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is here that the relationship between memory and perception begins to reveal one of the most intriguing mechanisms of the human brain. Most people believe that they first perceive the world and then remember it. But, in practice, these two functions happen together, intertwined, influencing each other all the time. Perception doesn't wait for memory to finish its work. And memory doesn't wait for perception to confirm the facts. They operate in parallel, exchanging information at a speed that consciousness simply cannot keep up with. Memory is not a faithful archive of the past. It is reconstructed every time it is accessed. Each memory you have is an updated version, influenced by your emotional state, the expectations of the moment, and the context in which it is activated. This means that often what seems to be a clear recollection is, in fact, an incomplete montage. And when this montage minimally fits what you are experiencing now, the brain triggers the sensation of recognition. This is where perception can be deceived. A familiar detail, a similar pattern, an emotion reminiscent of something experienced before. Sometimes this is enough to trigger a memory even before you consciously perceive your surroundings. The brain doesn't wait for confirmation. It anticipates. It decides before you think. And when this happens, the feeling of "this has already happened" arises strongly, even without a concrete memory to support this certainty. This phenomenon is not a simple error. It is the result of a highly efficient, yet imperfect, system. The brain works with probabilities. It doesn't need 100% certainty to act. It only needs enough clues to move forward. If memory offers fragments that seem to match the current situation, perception accepts this version as valid. The impact of this is immediate. The experience gains an emotional weight, a strangeness that is difficult to ignore. What's most fascinating is that, in this process, the mind creates a coherent narrative almost instantly. Even if information is missing, even if the memory is vague, the brain fills in the gaps. It constructs a story that makes sense internally. This is a hidden truth about how we think. The brain prefers an incomplete explanation to no explanation at all. It needs meaning. And when it doesn't find it, it creates it. This helps explain why these experiences are so compelling. It's not just a slight feeling of strangeness. Often, there's a quiet certainty accompanying the moment. An impression that something is out of place, yet at the same time all too familiar. Memory, even fragmented, lends credibility to perception. And perception in turn validates memory. A cycle forms behind the scenes of the mind. This mechanism plays an important role in our daily lives. It influences quick decisions, emotional responses, and instant judgments. When memory and perception are in sync, everything flows. But when this synchronicity breaks down, these curious, almost disconcerting experiences arise. Situations in which the brain seems to know something that consciousness hasn't yet understood. It's as if the mind is always one step ahead, making decisions based on internal shortcuts. There is also a factor of personal transformation in this understanding. Realizing that memory can deceive perception changes how we deal with absolute certainties. Not all convictions come from solid facts. Some come from quick associations, from past experiences that have been partially activated. This does not invalidate human experience, but invites a more attentive look at how we interpret the world. The impact of this extends beyond these strange sensations. It influences how we react to new people, environments, and situations. Sometimes we reject something because it triggers an old negative memory. Other times, we trust too much because something seems familiar, even without objective reason. These decisions happen quickly, almost invisibly, shaping our mindset and our way of acting without us realizing it. And the more you observe this process, the clearer it becomes that perceived reality is the result of a silent agreement between past and present. Memory offers clues. Perception sets the scene. And the brain presents all of this as if it were a solid, reliable experience. This is one of the great revelations about how the mind works. We don't just live what happens, we live what the brain interprets as happening. This dynamic explains why certain sensations arise out of nowhere and disappear as quickly as they came. They don't need to last. They only need to be convincing for a few seconds. Enough to generate impact, strangeness, and questioning. The brain isn't concerned with maintaining the coherent experience for very long. It's concerned with reacting now. And it is precisely at this point that the experience becomes even more intriguing. Because if memory can activate perception before rational confirmation, this means that there is an interval, small, almost invisible, where reality is still being decided within the mind. A space where emotion, memory, and expectation mix. Understanding this interval is essential to understanding why the brain sometimes seems to know something that you haven't yet consciously thought about. Before we delve any further into this journey behind the scenes of the mind, let us know how this is resonating with you. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there is a silent factor that completely alters how the brain interprets what is real, the emotional context. Emotions are not just reactions to what happens outside, they actively shape how the world is perceived from within. When the brain is under stress, anxiety, fatigue, or any intense emotional burden, it enters a different mode of operation. More defensive, faster, and much less discerning. In this state, familiarity ceases to be just a shortcut and becomes a refuge. In emotionally neutral moments, the brain can even check information with a little more calm. But when emotion rises, the system changes its priorities. The goal ceases to be precise understanding and becomes protection. Protection from discomfort, risk, uncertainty. To do this, the brain accelerates the search for known patterns. It looks for something that seems familiar, something that brings a minimal sense of control. And when it finds it, it accepts it, even if that familiarity is illusory. This is why feelings of alienation often arise during periods of heightened emotional vulnerability. Not because something external has drastically changed, but because the brain has changed the way it interprets signals. Under stress, it reduces the level of analysis and increases the level of association. It prefers to recognize rather than investigate. It prefers to conclude rather than question. This choice is not conscious, but it has a direct impact on the perception of reality. Mental fatigue is a clear example of this. When we are exhausted, the brain has already spent a large part of the energy available throughout the day. It doesn't want extra effort, so it starts to rely even more on shortcuts. Routine situations seem repetitive. Common conversations sound like déjà vu. Familiar places seem strangely known, even when they are not. Perception loses sharpness and memory takes control of the narrative. Anxiety intensifies this process. In anxious states, the brain is constantly trying to predict what will happen. It lives a few seconds ahead of the present. In this process, it pulls up old memories, past emotions, and similar experiences to try to anticipate outcomes. Current reality ends up being filtered through these internal predictions. And when an incomplete memory minimally fits the scenario, the brain reacts as if it were real. Recognition comes before confirmation. Emotional stress also distorts the perception of time. Moments seem to repeat themselves, scenes take on an air of excessive familiarity, as if they were being revisited. This happens because the brain, under pressure, reduces attention to new details and increases attention to already known patterns. It needs speed. And the greater the emotional burden, the lower the tolerance for ambiguity. Everything needs to make sense quickly, even if that meaning is constructed hastily. There's a hidden truth in this process. Emotions don't just color experience, they redefine what the brain considers reliable. An intense emotional state creates a lens through which reality is observed. And this lens can distort forms, meanings, and certainties. The more emotional you are, the less reliable your perception may be. Not because you're wrong, but because the brain is operating in survival mode. This mechanism has a profound impact on the decisions we make without realizing it. Quick judgments, misinterpretations, exaggerated reactions. All of this can be the result of an emotionally overloaded brain trying to protect itself. Familiarity emerges as a sign of relief. Something known means less risk. Even if it's just a momentary illusion, the brain accepts it. This understanding brings about an important transformation in how we observe ourselves. We begin to realize that many emotional certainties are not absolute truths, but internal responses to specific states. Perception ceases to be a faithful mirror of the world and begins to be understood as a living process, influenced by emotions, memories, and expectations. This changes the mindset with which we deal with strange experiences, because they cease to seem like flaws and begin to be seen as signs. Signs that the brain is overloaded. Signs that something internal is demanding attention. Signs that the mind is trying to maintain stability amidst emotional chaos. When we understand this, these sensations cease to frighten us and begin to reveal important information about our internal state. They become part of the journey of self-discovery, not just isolated curiosities. And the more you allow yourself to observe these emotional reactions, the more you realize that lived reality is the result of multiple layers operating simultaneously. Emotion, memory, perception, and expectation intertwine behind the scenes of the mind, creating experiences that seem solid but are constantly adjusting. Nothing is fixed. Everything is interpreted. And this understanding opens the door to even deeper revelations about how the brain constructs the sensation of being in the world. Because when emotion and familiarity meet, the brain can validate experiences even before checking if they correspond to the present. This meeting point is delicate, powerful, and extremely revealing. It is there that the strangest, most intense, and most difficult to explain sensations arise. And understanding this process is essential to understanding why, at certain moments, reality seems to slip through our fingers, even when everything seems normal. Before moving on to this reflection on the emotional aspects of perception, write a simple sentence here. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, Because there's a question that often arises at this point in the journey. If all of this is an interpretation by the brain, why does the sensation seem so real? Why doesn't it sound like imagination, daydreaming, or distraction? The answer lies in a crucial detail of brain function: time. More specifically, in the timing with which different areas of the brain come into action. The brain doesn't work in a line, waiting for one area to finish before another begins. It works in parallel with multiple systems processing information simultaneously, but at different speeds. Some regions are extremely fast, almost impulsive. Others are slower, analytical, and careful. What happens in these strange phenomena of the mind is that the areas responsible for recognition come into play before the areas responsible for logical verification. When a situation rapidly activates recognition circuits, those linked to memory, familiarity, and the "I know this" mentality, the brain receives a very strong validation signal. This signal is loaded with emotion and certainty. It's like an internal stamp saying, "This is true." Only later, a few milliseconds later, do the areas that question, compare details, and check for inconsistencies come into play. But, in that tiny interval, the experience has already been registered as real. This slight delay is enough to create a deep conviction. It's not something you choose to feel. The sensation simply appears, complete, convincing. The brain confirms before checking. And when confirmation comes first, everything that follows only tries to explain what has already been accepted. Logic begins to work in favor of the sensation, not the other way around. That's why trying to rationalize these experiences as they happen is often so difficult. The perception has already been emotionally imprinted. The body has already reacted. The conscious mind enters the scene late, trying to understand something that has already taken shape. This inverted order creates the impression that there is something wrong with reality, when in fact what happened was a silent inversion in the validation process. From a scientific point of view, this is nothing mystical. It's a side effect of an extremely efficient but imperfect brain. Speed has always been more valuable than absolute precision. Recognizing quickly meant surviving. Questioning too much could be costly. This model worked very well throughout evolution, but today, in a world full of stimuli, overlapping memories, and intense emotions, it generates confusing experiences. The impact of this on subjective experience is enormous. When the brain activates recognition first, it constructs a solid, almost unquestionable sense of reality. Even if, seconds later, logic says that something doesn't make sense, the sensation has already left its mark. That's why these experiences don't seem vague or weak. They have weight. They have presence. They occupy space in consciousness. There is a hidden truth in this process that is rarely discussed. The sensation of reality depends not only on the facts, but on the order in which the brain processes the information. If recognition comes first, the experience is validated. If verification came first, perhaps the sensation would never arise. But the brain doesn't wait. It acts. It decides. And only then does it revise. This dynamic influences much more than isolated episodes of estrangement. It shapes the beliefs, convictions, and certainties we carry throughout life. Many important decisions are made based on feelings that seem true at the moment they arose. Logic comes in later, often only to justify what has already been chosen. This affects mindset, behavior, and even how we interpret our own history. When you understand this, you begin to realize that the perceived reality is the result of a delicate choreography between different areas of the brain. An invisible dance happening behind the scenes, where milliseconds make all the difference. Human experience is not built calmly and orderly. It is built in rapid, emotional layers, only later revised by reason. This understanding also brings about a silent transformation in how we deal with these sensations. They cease to be frightening or inexplicable and begin to be seen as windows into the inner workings of the mind. They are not flaws. They are consequences. Consequences of a brain that needs to make quick decisions in a world that demands ever more attention. And the more you observe this process, the more you realize that the feeling of reality is something fragile, malleable, and profoundly human. It can arise before analysis, before verification, before full awareness. And when it arises, it carries a force that cannot be ignored. That's why these experiences are so impactful. They reveal that certainty doesn't stem from truth itself, but from how the brain organizes the timing of perception. This revelation changes the way we look at our own internal experiences. It invites a more curious, less reactive perspective. It shows that not every sensation needs to be fought or denied, but understood. Because understanding this brain timing error is to understand a little more about how the mind constructs the sensation of being alive, present, and conscious. And as this understanding deepens, an inevitable question arises about what happens when this process is frequently repeated in different contexts, mixing memory, emotion, and perception at even more complex levels. It is then that the phenomenon begins to reveal even more intriguing layers of human experience, layers that go beyond simple sensation and directly touch upon how the brain organizes time and reality. Before continuing this reflection, write a short sentence for me here. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a point where this phenomenon ceases to be merely occasional and becomes more frequent. And this point has much less to do with something rare in the brain and much more to do with how we live today. The human brain hasn't changed at the same rate as the world around it. It continues to operate within the same basic limitations, while the environment demands constant attention, quick decisions, and uninterrupted stimuli. When sleep is insufficient, for example, the brain enters extreme economy mode. Poor sleep doesn't just affect mood or physical disposition, it directly affects how memory and perception communicate. Lack of rest reduces the ability to logically check and increases reliance on mental shortcuts. Recognition happens faster while verification loses strength. Familiarity takes priority. And in this scenario, confusion between what seems known and what is real becomes more likely. Excessive stimuli follow the same logic. Screens, notifications, simultaneous information, rapid changes of focus. The modern brain is bombarded all the time. To cope with this, it simplifies. It groups experiences, reduces details, and increasingly relies on existing patterns. The more stimuli that enter, the less space is left for deep analysis. Perception becomes more superficial, while memory tries to fill the gaps with old references. The result is a constant feeling of repetition, of premature recognition, of déjà vu. Constant multitasking further intensifies this process. Doing several things at once doesn't mean the brain is truly focused on everything. In practice, it rapidly switches between tasks, expending energy with each change. This cognitive fatigue reduces the accuracy of perception. The brain begins to anticipate more than observe. It assumes more than it confirms. And when this happens, familiar experiences easily surface, even when the context is new. Mental overload completes this cycle. When the mind is full, there's no room for nuance. The brain seeks stability. It looks for something that makes sense quickly. It needs to reduce the complexity of the world to continue functioning. And the quickest way to do this is through familiarity. Something known requires less effort. Something recognizable seems safer. Even if this safety is only apparent, the brain accepts it. There's a hidden truth at this point in the journey: the modern brain is constantly on edge. Not because it's weak, but because the environment demands more than it was designed to continuously offer. Our current lifestyle fosters this kind of confusion. Not dramatically or alarmingly, but silently, cumulatively. Small daily stresses add up until perception begins to fail in subtle details. The impact of this doesn't appear all at once. It manifests itself in small sensations. Moments when everything seems too familiar. Conversations that sound repetitive. Days that seem the same. Situations that awaken a strange certainty without a clear explanation. The brain isn't broken. It's tired. And a tired brain trusts the past more than the present. This understanding brings about an important shift in mindset. Instead of seeing these experiences as something isolated or too strange, we begin to see them as signs of limits. The brain is saying that it needs to simplify, reduce, economize. It's not asking for quick answers but for attention to context. These sensations are often reflections of a mental pace that is too fast for a system that needs pauses to function accurately. Understanding this changes how we interpret our own internal workings. The journey is no longer about eliminating these experiences, but about understanding when and why they arise. At what points in life do they intensify? During which phases is the brain most overloaded? This observation doesn't require absolute control but awareness. The more stimuli, the less checking. The less rest, the more shortcuts. The greater the pressure, the more the brain relies on familiarity. This is not an isolated flaw, it's a logical consequence. And understanding this logic allows us to look at these sensations with less fear and more curiosity. They become clues about the state of mind, not threats to reality. There is also a cumulative effect that is rarely noticed. When this type of confusion becomes frequent, it begins to influence daily decisions. Choices are made on autopilot. Emotional reactions precede analysis. The brain, always trying to protect itself, assumes it already knows what is happening. And often, it is simply repeating old patterns in a new scenario. This perception opens the door to important revelations. Revelations about how the pace of life shapes internal experience. About how excessive stimuli impact mental clarity. About how familiarity can become a distorted filter when used excessively. None of this means that the mind is failing. It only means that it is operating at the limit of its adaptive capacity. And when you start to notice these signs, you realize they don't appear by chance. They emerge at specific stages of life, during periods of increased pressure, in moments of transition. They are silent indicators that something internal is asking for adjustment. The brain, confusing familiarity with reality, is trying to maintain coherence amidst the overload. This finding paves the way for an even deeper understanding of what happens when these mechanisms cease to be episodic and begin to shape how we perceive the world continuously. Because, from this point on, we are not just talking about isolated sensations, but about how the mind organizes the experience of time, repetition, and identity itself in a scenario of constant stimuli. Before we move on with this reflection, write a short sentence for me here. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because everything said so far inevitably leads to a question that touches on something much bigger than simple brain phenomena. If memory can anticipate perception, if familiarity can be used as a seal of security, if emotional context can distort what we feel as real, then who is really in control of the reality we live every day? This question is not comfortable, but it is profoundly revealing. From a very young age, we learn to believe that there is a solid, objective external world independent of us, and that our role is merely to perceive it. But what neuroscience and honest observation of human experience show is something quite different. The brain doesn't just receive reality. It constructs the experience of reality. It decides what gets highlighted, what is ignored, what seems true, and what goes unnoticed. Much of what we call living happens behind the scenes of the mind, even before any conscious reflection. This means that daily life is not just a sequence of external events, but a continuous interpretation of those events. Every conversation, every place, every decision is filtered through expectations, memories, emotions, and old patterns. The reality you experience is the result of this internal processing. And when the brain confuses familiarity with truth, it's not deceiving you maliciously. It's simply following the logic it has always followed, creating coherence, maintaining stability, avoiding unnecessary effort. The impact of this understanding is profound. It changes how we look at absolute certainties, unwavering convictions, and even the sense of control we believe we have. Many of the decisions we make throughout the day don't stem from deep rational analysis, but from internal sensations that seemed real at the moment they arose. The mind validates first, explains later. And most of the time we move forward without questioning this order. There is a hidden truth in this process that directly touches our journey as human beings. If reality is, to a large extent, interpreted, then living is not just reacting to the world but constantly engaging in dialogue with one's own mind. This doesn't mean that everything is an illusion or that nothing is real. It means that what we experience is a delicate combination of external stimuli and internal constructs. A silent dance between what happens outside and what happens inside. This realization can be disconcerting but also liberating. It invites us to develop a more curious and less reactive mindset. Instead of accepting every sensation as absolute truth, we begin to see it as a signal. An indication of something happening in the brain, in the emotional state, in memory. The experience ceases to be something that simply dominates us and becomes something we can observe with greater awareness. When viewed from this perspective, these strange brain phenomena cease to be mere isolated curiosities and become gateways to a deeper understanding of the human mind. They reveal how the brain organizes time, how it constructs continuity, how it creates a sense of identity. They reveal that what we call now is often a meeting point between past and expectation, mediated by emotions and cognitive shortcuts. And perhaps the most profound reflection is this: how much of what you experience throughout the day is truly lived in the present, and how much is reinterpreted based on what has already happened? How often do you react not to what is happening, but to what your brain believes is happening? These questions don't have simple answers, but they open up space for a more honest observation of the human experience. Our channel's identity is born precisely at this intersection between science and mystery. Between what we already know about the brain and what still causes us bewilderment. Between rational explanations and subjective experiences that we have all had, but rarely stop to analyze. Here, curiosity is not treated as something superficial, but as a tool to see beyond the obvious. When you begin to realize that reality can be more internal than external, something silently changes. The world doesn't lose meaning, it gains layers. Every strange sensation, every moment of inexplicable familiarity, every distorted perception ceases to be a mistake and becomes a clue. A clue about how the mind works, about how the brain tries to maintain coherence in a complex and fast-paced world. This understanding doesn't end the reflection, it deepens it. Because from this point on, the question ceases to be simply, why does this happen? And becomes, what else is the brain doing without me realizing it? There are many other mechanisms operating behind the scenes, influencing how you perceive time, your body, your emotions, and even your own sense of self. And it is precisely in this territory where science and experience meet, that this journey continues to expand. Before we move on to this more existential reflection, leave a word or phrase for me here. Comment below, that makes sense to me. And if all of this made sense to you, if at any point in the video you recognized yourself in these strange experiences of the mind, stay with me a little longer. This channel exists precisely to explore these inner workings of the brain calmly, curiously, and in depth, without ready-made answers but with good questions. If you feel that this type of content helps you see your own mind more clearly, subscribing is a simple way to continue this journey together, video after video. If you've made it this far, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," or, "I'm with you until the end, I read everything," and that also helps me understand which topics sparked the most reflection in you. And if this video made you think, question, or look at a past experience with different eyes, a like is just a silent way of saying that this conversation was worthwhile. Now, if you want to continue exploring the mysteries of the brain and perception, there's a video here that complements this topic perfectly. Click on it and stay with me there, because the more we observe the mind working, the more interesting questions begin to arise.